Okay, now we looked last week. You know how it is here. This is the story. We're doing a big overview, so I'm going through a lot of material, and I'm going fairly quickly, but that's just how it is. I want to give kind of an overview of the content, and then Terry, I'm following him. He's preaching the sermons. We're on the same topics. But last week we looked at the book of Judges, and this morning we're going to look at the book of Ruth, the events of which take place, it says in Chapter 1, in the days when the judges ruled. So these events take place during the period of the judges. So we know it's sometime between Joshua's death in 1366, around 1366 BC. A little bit after that actually begins the period of judges, up until the anointing of Saul as king in 1051. So sometime during that period of time. And despite Israel's faithlessness during the period of Judges that I sketched for you last week, we see in Ruth that God was using faithful people in His work to bless the nation and ultimately to bless the world. So even during all of that tumult, that faithlessness, that repeated apostasy, that repeated idolatry, we see taking place during the period of Judges, and it's not clear when, probably toward the latter part. But you've got here, God is at work using faithful people. Now, in those days, it says a famine came on the land of Israel, which prompted Elimelech, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah. And that's significant because of the connection to David. But it says an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah, he came, that prompted Elimelech to move to Moab with his wife and his two sons, his wife Naomi and their two sons Mahlon and Chilion. And Moab is in this region east of the Dead Sea that you can see there on the map. So there's a famine. Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons Mahlon and Chilion, to avoid the effects of the famine, they moved to Moab. And then after Elimelech died, Naomi's two sons each took a Moabite wife. One is named Orpah, and the other one is named Ruth. Now, there are a number of scholars that argue that the sons marrying Moabite women, that was something improper that Naomi should have prevented. This is kind of a complicated question. I disagree with that, but I don't have time to go into to explain why. Now, if you're interested in why, you can go look at the online notes of Ruth that are at theoutlet.us. But if I started chasing all of those kinds of things, that's why when I taught Ruth, I took 7 weeks to teach it. We're going to go through it in 40 minutes today. So I just can't pursue all of the questions. But you can see my thinking on the subject, at least if you go to that website. Now, Mahlon and Chilion, they both died without having any children. Okay, that leaves Elimelech's line on the verge of extinction, because they have two kids, Mahlon and Chilion. They both die with no children. So his lineage, his line is on the verge of extinction. And their death also leaves Naomi without provision or protection. And this is something hard for us to appreciate, that as a childless, aging widow, Naomi was in the worst possible position for an Israelite woman. The security and the status that a husband and children afforded a woman in that culture, and the blessing that the children would have been to her in old age, they're gone. See, so here she is. She's a woman now. She's widowed, has no husband. She has no children. She's in a terrible, desperate situation, and you can feel her anguish. And as I say, this is something that's difficult to translate into our culture. But you can feel her anguish in her description of her situation in chapter 1, verse 13 as too bitter. And in her statement in chapter 1, verse 20, that the Almighty had dealt very bitterly with her. And in her statement in chapter 1, verse 21, that she was empty and that the Almighty had brought calamity on her. Now, I don't take those statements as sinful accusations against God, but as a cry of an afflicted soul. You see, that like Job saw God behind her suffering, but she was convinced that she had done nothing worthy of such severe discipline. So she's just saying, the Lord has afflicted me. And she's in this great bitterness. Now in chapter 1, verses 6 through 22, Naomi, she decides to return to Bethlehem with her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. They're following, and she had decided to return because she'd heard that the Lord had brought an end to the drought that had caused their family to move to Moab in the first place, a number of years prior to that. And the three of them actually start out on the journey. So Naomi's heading back to Bethlehem. The drought, she's heard the Lord has brought an end to that. The famine is ended, and she's going back. And her sisters-in-law begin the journey with her. Now, whether that's just a custom to accompany somebody leaving out a ways out of town, but in any event, the three of them, they start the journey out of town together. And at some point on the road, Naomi urges her daughters-in-law, urges Orpah and Ruth to each return to her mother's house. And what's going on is that Naomi felt so targeted by God. She felt so targeted that she at that point had no hope regarding the future of any who would cast their lot with her. You see, she sees herself as somebody who's targeted by God. So who in the world would want to hook up with me? Look what's happening to me. There's no future in that for you doing that. Better to return to Moab than to follow this aging widow who, without God on her side, offered no hope of a new husband for her daughters-in-law, and thus no hope for the blessing of family. See, she finally persuaded Orpah. She said, go back. No, this is, it's basically pointless. So she finally persuaded Orpah to go back, but Ruth was just adamant about remaining with her and could not be persuaded otherwise. So Naomi finally relented and said, okay. Now Naomi and Ruth, then they arrive in Bethlehem in chapter 1, verses 19 to 21, at the beginning of the barley harvest, which is in late April or early May. So they wind up, they arrive back there in Bethlehem, and the women of the town said, is this Naomi? Now that may just be a statement of surprise because she'd been gone for so long that, well, she showed back up. Wow, is this Naomi after all these years? But it also could be a statement of how her suffering had affected her physically. Is this Naomi who had gone away, this bright, full of life person, radiant? And now look at her. She's just this haggard, beaten, suffering person. That may be in there. But they ask this question, is this Naomi? And Naomi's state of mind is clear in her response to those who ask this question, is this Naomi? She tells them not to call her Naomi. Now, don't call me Naomi, because the name Naomi, it means pleasant or lovely. And that no longer fit her circumstances. That name may have fit before. But after the death of my husband and the death of my two sons and having no children, that name doesn't fit my situation. Instead, she says they should call her Mara, which means bitter, because God Almighty had afflicted her. She left with a husband, she left with two sons, and is returning with no husband, no sons, no grandchildren. Why call her pleasant when the Lord had singled her out for calamity? You see, she left full of hope, a husband and two sons, and the hope of a burgeoning family, and this growing family. She comes back now empty. So why call her pleasant when she's been struck like that? Well, in chapter 2, verses 1 to 23, it opens up. The author just kind of casually throws out this name Boaz. You see, in this book, inspiration doesn't take away from artistry. You see, whoever's writing this book, this is a literary gem. As the author just throws out, casually mentions that Naomi had a relative on her late husband's side, a man named Boaz. He was a man of means and status, and just kind of throws that out there. Okay, then the story picks up, and Ruth asks Naomi for permission to go out and gather from the fields being harvested ears of grain that were dropped or left standing by the reapers. This is the practice of gleaning. It was something that was protected for the poor in Israel. That people who had fields were prohibited from going back and going over them and over them and over them and stripping them absolutely clean. You couldn't go to the edges, and you had other requirements. And they did that so the poor could come and pick up basically the scraps. And so that's what she's doing. This speaks of their circumstance, is she wants to go out and glean in the fields to get some food. So she asks Naomi for permission to do that. Naomi tells her to go. Now, having no idea who Boaz was, no idea who this fellow Boaz, who's a relative of Elimelech's, she has no idea who he is. And it says Ruth just happened to end up in Boaz's field. And we would say, Shazam. Just happened to end up in Boaz's field. You see, and coming on the heels of the statement that Boaz was from the clan of Elimelech, see, the author wants the reader to understand that what was happenstance from Ruth's perspective was in fact the providential hand of God. You see, this is how God works. This isn't the only way God works, but he's doing this. So she goes out, I want to go out and go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, I think I'll go out here. What do you know? Winds up in the field of Boaz. And in the same vein, verse 4 of chapter 2, it says, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. So he comes from the town. His field is out away. But he just happens to show up. When she happens to stumble onto his thing, right when she's there, he shows up. He arrives at the field from town. He shows up, and Ruth just happens to be where he can see her. I mean, that's just very fortunate. Just very fortunate how this all worked out. And he asks about her. He sees her, and he recognizes, I don't know who this is. And he sees her, and he asks about her, and he's told that she's the young Moabite who came back with Naomi from Moab, and that she'd requested permission to glean in the field, and she'd been hard at it. She'd been working hard since the early morning. Now, she requests permission because even though it was a responsibility and a duty, you can imagine that people would find ways of getting around that because they were cheap and wanted to keep all the stuff. So that's where this comes from. Why do you go ask if it's a duty? Well, because reality is that people don't always do their duty. So she's going to go ask and make sure it was fine that she could do that. And so she's there. Now, Boaz told Ruth to go, not to glean in any other field. You see, in the way you've got these big patches, huge tracts of land, and one owner will own a section of it, but it's not like marked out. Like, it's not that Boaz's is red and the next guy's is blue, like in maps. The next guy's is, it's not that way. They're just fields, and the people, the workers, know where his field is. And so he tells her, look, you don't go and glean in anybody else's field. Stick with my field, and don't worry about it because I've told my guys not to mess with you. Okay, now that would be a concern, you see. Number one, she's a woman, and secondly, she's a foreigner. And so you could see her at least being hassled, if not facing something else. So he tells her, you stick with me, and I'm telling my guys not to mess with you, see, so that you'll be okay. And he also gave her permission to drink freely from the water that he brings out for his harvesters. We think water, so what water? Having water out there when you're working out in this place. So when they bring the water truck out, you see, he says, no, you go ahead. You drink freely from it. So that was something. And Ruth is simply blown away by his kindness and his generosity. He's treating her essentially as an equal to his hired Israelite field workers. And she's a Moabite woman. So she's just really taken by this, moved and impressed by that. And Boaz explained to her that he'd heard about the kindness and the extraordinary commitment that she had shown Naomi. Because, she's saying, go back, and all. She said, no, I'm sticking with you. That's it. Where you die, I'm going to die. You're buried, I'm buried. I'm staying with you. You and me. We're bound together. Okay, so he'd heard about this. He's not the only one. This was news. Now, later in the day, he invites Ruth to share in the midday meal that he provides his workers. They're out there working all day. Part of the deal is he gives them a meal. I don't know that all the landowners did that, but he's a good guy. And so he has this, they share in this midday meal, and he personally serves her the food, this roasted grain, and he provides her more than she could eat. You see, he showed this foreigner compassion, generosity, acceptance. Here is somebody who understands something about God, and he's reflecting it in his life and how he treats people. And who's God using? He's going to use this man. He's going to use Ruth. What's going on in the culture? Idolatry, all of this craziness. He says, all right, I got some people I can work with. And that's what he's doing. So here's somebody who reflects God in that way. And when Ruth returned to her gleaning, have this midday meal, she goes back to the gleaning she'd been working on since early in the morning. And Boaz tells Ruth, he says, look, he tells his workers, don't rebuke her if she goes over to glean near the piles of already cut grain. That was a no-no. You see, the guys owning the field don't want you getting over where they've already cut the stuff and you start wandering over there and saying, I'm going to basically cherry pick all the stuff that's been in the piles ready to be bound. He tells them, if she goes over and starts gleaning over there, don't worry about it. He also tells them, he says, listen, and by the way, while you're at it, why don't you just pull off a couple of things and throw them down for her to find? Okay, so in that light, you see, she's out there gleaning, and as a result, she gleans an amazing amount of grain that day. She winds up with about 30 pounds, some would estimate it as more. Now, this is serious for gleaning. So she winds up with an amazing amount, and she lugs her bounty back to town, and Naomi excitedly asks her where she'd gleaned. And the tone of that question is no doubt like, where in the world did you glean today that you made such a haul? Where in the world were you doing this? That you can come back here with 30 pounds. And when Ruth identified her benefactor as Boaz, you see, she probably heard his name during conversations in the fields. Well, Naomi then praised Yahweh as the one, she says, who has not abandoned his hesed, his faithful, loving commitment. He has not abandoned his hesed toward the living and the dead. This is what Naomi says when she hears that Boaz is the benefactor. She recognized, you see, that God was at work. This was his hand in her stumbling into contact with Boaz and in Boaz's generosity to her. Naomi said, I see the hand of God working here. She recognized that, and that caused her to realize that God had maintained his commitment to the well-being of her family, both to her and Ruth, the living, and to Mahlon and Elimelech, the dead. You see, he'd maintained his commitment to them. And with a heart renewed by the hope of God's favor, you see, she's now coming alive spiritually as this person who had been absolutely crushed and felt targeted, and God was her enemy, and God didn't like her, and God was punishing her, and she didn't understand why, and she's like this. Now she's starting to, what's going on here? What? Boaz? He was very generous to you? All right, so her heart and her spirit, it's being refreshed. You see, this is coming. Her heart is renewed by the hope of God's favor. And with that, she seemed to realize the potential that Boaz posed for Ruth and for the survival of Elimelech and Mahlon's line. Okay, because Mahlon's dead, no children, but she's seeing something here. She's seeing this potential that Naomi was beginning to hope along those lines. It's suggested by the fact she exclaimed that Boaz was a close relative, one of the kinsman redeemers. He's one of the kinsman redeemers. Now, kinsman redeemer, it's a term from Israelite family law. You see, it's a term from Israelite family law that describes it's not a precise kinship relation like aunt, uncle, or any of that kind of thing. But it's a term from Israelite family law that speaks of near relatives to whom both law and custom gave certain duties and obligations toward the clan. So you had a certain family helping, family saving responsibility. And that could fall on you depending on where you were in position to different people.
So she says he's one of the kinsman redeemers. And Ruth then adds that Boaz had told her that she could work in his field until they had finished the entire harvest. Okay, meaning the harvest of both barley and wheat. So it's not just the barley harvest. He said I could work in the field until I finished the entire thing. And Naomi approved of that offer. And as a result, Ruth is in Boaz's fields from late April to early June, maybe 6 weeks that she's in Boaz's field. But there are no further contacts with Boaz mentioned. So you're like going, what's up? You're saying, what is up? You're left wondering what's going to come of Ruth's providential encounter with Boaz. Clearly something's up here. She just stumbles onto this thing. He takes all this stuff. And then you hear that, well, she's going to be there the whole harvest. And you're, and? What happened? Well, you see, this is a story, you see. This is all what is revealed by God, but it's revealed in a really neat way. And so you're sitting there wondering what's going to come of that. What will happen after this encounter? Well, Naomi in chapter 3, Naomi's interested in finding a husband for Ruth, somebody who would provide security and protection for her. And you can understand she loves Ruth, and Ruth has shown her incredible faithfulness and loyalty. And Naomi saw Boaz as the one who should fulfill that role. This is her idea that Boaz is the guy who should do that. Now, in fact, she had a plan. She's got a plan to encourage Boaz to assume what she perceived to be his responsibility. Presumably not being aware of the fact that he was not the nearest kinsman redeemer. You say, well, how could that happen? Well, perhaps the rules of kinsman redeemer were more complicated than we understand, or maybe they were related in ways that she was mistaken about. But in any event, she doesn't realize this. She has a plan that she's going to encourage Boaz to take the role of the kinsman redeemer as she understands and perceives that role. And that's significant, at least in my understanding of the book, because I think she has a rather expansive view of whether the kinsman redeemer role operates in this particular situation. But in any event, she has a plan for encouraging to do that. So she called Ruth's attention to the fact that Boaz is going to be spending the night on the threshing floor, winnowing barley, and then she instructed Ruth on what to do. So she apparently knows that it's that time, wherever the harvest is, he's going to be on the threshing floor. I'm sure that's where the owners go. He's going to be there, and here's what I want you. She's going to tell her what she needs to do. She tells Ruth, in essence, look, you need to doll up. Tells her, bathe, put on your perfume, and this kind of thing. Okay, you need to doll up and then hide out at the threshing floor. And then after Boaz goes to sleep, what I want you to do is go over and uncover his feet, or some would say his lower legs, and then you lie down. You uncover his feet or his lower legs, and you lie down. And she said Boaz would tell you what to do after that. Now, this is obviously some kind of symbolic gesture that Boaz is expected to understand. It's some kind of symbolic gesture he's expected to understand. Now, given Ruth's marriage proposal in verse 9, which it's clear that's what she's doing there, given that marriage proposal, it may be that lying at Boaz's feet, it symbolized that very same proposal by presenting herself as one humbly seeking his protection. So if she lies at his feet, maybe that's the symbol that says, I'm seeking your protection. Because we know in verse 9 she's asking him to marry her. So you have that now. Ruth did as Naomi instructed her, and with his feet or legs having been uncovered, Boaz wakes up shivering. And I think that's many of the translations say he was startled. And the word means shaking, and a number of commentators, I think, rightly see this as he's shivering because of the cold, and I think that was the whole plan, is that you uncover his feet so he will gently wake up instead of having you startle him, and that may tend to put him in a bad mood, or I want him to wake up very smoothly. So he wakes up shivering, and he sees this woman he can't recognize because of the darkness. And he sees her there lying at his feet. And he asks the woman, he asks who she is, and she answers, says, I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. You see, and as Daniel Block says, however strange that may seem to us, that was clearly understood as a proposal. She was saying, this is your role, spread your wings over me, take me into your household. You see, it was a proposal of marriage. Now, Ruth based her request on the fact that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, but that raises this question. Well, look, if he's a kinsman redeemer and he's legally obligated by that fact to marry her, you see, if that's the case, then why risk all of this stuff? Why risk this nighttime rendezvous on the threshing floor rather than simply calling his duty to his attention? Why all this skullduggery and all this kind of stuff? If it's just that's it, that's your duty, hey, it's your obligation to marry me. Why not do that? And what I think is going on is that this idea, I think that Naomi's view of the kinsman redeemer's role in this particular instance as encompassing a duty to marry Ruth was at least debatable. You see, I think she had a broader, more expansive view of that. Perhaps she was emboldened to have Ruth assert her broader picture of the kinsman redeemer's duty in this case, because she recognized that God had worked providentially in bringing them together and saw that Boaz had reacted very favorably. So she's taken that as an indication. Go ahead. Go ahead and present this broader interpretation of the kinsman redeemer duty to him and just put that out there before him. She suspects that he's going to endorse that. And he'll say, okay, I agree. That falls within the purview of the family protection role of the kinsman redeemer. Because you see, this situation is atypical. He's connected to Elimelech, but now we're talking about, a daughter-in-law down here who's still of age where she can have kids. So you can see it's just like divorce remarriage things. You know how many permutations there are that exist on them. So this is an odd little twist. So you could see that somebody's saying, well, no, the duty doesn't encompass that. Well, Naomi's taking the broader view, and she's assuming, okay, let's go ahead and present this, and I think he'll take it. Now, Naomi probably had that matter raised in private. She did it this way, I think, in case she's wrong about how Boaz is going to react. By doing it in private, at least gave them the option of saying, if Boaz says, what? No dice. No, that's crazy. I'm not obligated to do that. Okay, well, that kept it private and then at least gave them the opportunity whether they wanted to go public with it. Oh, yes, it is. Or they say, okay, if you're not going to, all right, we thought that's how, that was the understanding we had. So I think that's why she has her do it this way. Now, the tension, at least as I see at this point in the story, the way I see it, the tension here is whether Boaz is going to embrace this view of the kinsman redeemer's duty, whether he's going to see that as a proper expression of the family guardian principle that's inherent in the kinsman redeemer role, or whether he's going to refuse to help, maybe even take umbrage at the request. How dare you? A Moabite woman coming to me, trying to hook me into marriage? I got stuff. You're a gold digger. Okay, so you didn't know how that's going to work. So see, to me, the tension in the story is he going to accept this broader, arguable view, or is he going to say, you're crazy? That's not how I understand the role of the kinsman redeemer. And so that's the question. That seems to me to be the tension here. Now, based on what has already been revealed about Yahweh's providential involvement and Boaz's reaction already, you're not completely surprised by the response. You see, Boaz reacts very positively to the proposal. I'm down. That's right. I agree. I'm in. I think that's right. Okay, well, that's a great heart. Good. So he's down with it. He wants to do it. And he tells her not to fear. He's going to do all that she asked. Okay, he tells Ruth not to fear. And he acknowledged that he was indeed the kinsman redeemer. And the implication of that acknowledgement, if I'm on the right track with this, is that he accepted the validity of Ruth's claim and thus the validity of her view of his duty. That your duty as kinsman redeemer encompasses a responsibility to marry me and as kinsman redeemer to have a child who will then be Mahlon's descendant and connected to that property of Elimelech's. Okay, there's something about the property. We don't know that yet until we get to chapter 4, but there's something about that, see? So, but he says, look, he accepts that, yes, I am the kinsman redeemer, so he's accepting that view, but he tells him, look, but there's another kinsman redeemer who's closer to Elimelech than I am. See, in this Israelite family law, he says, no, yes, I am a kinsman redeemer, but I'm second in priority. There's somebody, well, now we got a wrench in the whole works here. What's going to happen with that? You see, there's a wrench now in the story. Now, presumably, as I said, Naomi was unaware that this other kinsman redeemer had priority when she sent Ruth to Boaz. But Boaz told Ruth, he says, he would bring the matter of her redemption to a resolution in the morning, and he assured her with an oath that he would redeem her if the prior kinsman redeemer refused to do so. If the guy with priority, the guy who's in line ahead of me, if he won't do it, I'm telling you flat out, I'm going to do it. So he assures her that way. Now this to redeem, that presumably means more than simply to marry her, but it means to marry her in the capacity of a kinsman redeemer. You see, the effect of which marrying her that way would mean that the first child would have some kind of legal right or legal tie to the deceased person, to Mahlon, and to his property. You see, so that's what I think is in play here. As indicated in chapter 4, redemption by the kinsman redeemer, it includes a transaction involving Elimelech's property. You don't know that yet, but we get the property aspect brought up in chapter 4. So that's what he's saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to marry you as a kinsman redeemer, which will mean that our offspring are then legal descendants of Mahlon and associated legally tied to that property. Okay, the clan property. So he will have descendants and there will still be people there on his property who are his descendants maintaining that. So I think that's what's going on. And then Boaz, Ruth tells Naomi all that Boaz did for her. Tells her about what he did for her. Naomi says, look, wait and see how things are going to play out. Because she's absolutely convinced that Boaz would pursue this matter to a conclusion. She says, he's going to find out about this. He's going to get to the bottom of this. So you're left in suspense. How's this going to work out? We've got this wonderful story, and now we've got this fly in the ointment. We've got this guy who's there. Well, what's going to come of that? Well, Boaz in chapter 4, he convenes a legal assembly, which is a gathering at the city gate of a certain number of people. And he convenes a legal assembly, and then he negotiates in chapter 4, verse 3 through 8, with the nearer kinsman redeemer. So he's talking to this guy, and he says, look, he tells the other redeemer that Naomi's selling the field of Elimelech. Okay, now that selling is a kind of a loose term here. Selling the field of Elimelech, their mutual relative. And that's the first mention of family land. It's the first mention. It's difficult to really understand what is going on here. You see, because we see that Naomi and Ruth are destitute. She's out gleaning. You think, well, what is she, a landowner? Is she like a baron and she's just keeping it quiet? A baroness and keeping it quiet, or what? Well, so exactly what is happening here? It's not easy to figure out. It seems clear that Naomi has some kind of interest in Elimelech's field that was of no practical use to her in easing her difficult circumstances. So she's in dire circumstances. She has some kind of legal interest in this field, but whatever that legal interest is, it's not helping her. Now that much seems clear. So you say, well, what is it that is going on here? The nature of her interest is not completely clear, but you can kind of think about it, speculate about it. And what I think is going on is that Elimelech had transferred to someone outside of the clan the right to use and possess a field or a piece of property they had until the year of Jubilee. You see, that's how things would work, is that at the year of Jubilee, the property would revert to him or to his family. So you basically, you get an estate for a set number of years. So it looks like he had, now maybe that was because of the famine. that he had been pushed so hard financially that he had to go ahead and sell the right to occupy and use that land to somebody outside the clan until the year of Jubilee. Now, as Elimelech's widow, Naomi apparently had a right to redeem that property. In other words, had a right to go to that person and say, listen, I know that the deal was you got to keep this till Jubilee, but I have a right absolutely to come now and tell you I'm buying it back. Guy says, I don't want to step, too bad for you. I have a right of redemption. Okay, that seems to be what she has, but that's of no value to her, right? Because she has no money. So she has no money and no right to, or she has a right to buy it back, but she's not in a financial position to do so. So it seems what is going on is that Naomi is selling in the sense of transferring. And you can look at, there's more I could say about that. But selling in the sense of transferring her right of redemption of Elimelech's interest, she can transfer that. She can't use it. She can transfer it to the nearest kinsman redeemer, and which that person is presumably then required to exercise, or he must pass it on to the next person in line. Okay, so here we have, she's got a right to redeem this property if she can do so. She says, I'm going to pass that on to the nearest kinsman redeemer. If I do that, he then must go and take money and buy back that interest from that person. Okay? If he doesn't do that, then he has to pass the right of redemption to the next person in line. I think that's what's going on, but as I say, it's not hard to know. I mean, we're way back here. It's not hard to know the law in this country right now. And so when you're going back to ancient Israel and digging around and trying to say, well, exactly how did these things work, you're putting together clues. And I think that's what was going on here. So, he winds up, so she's transferring that. Now, Boaz tells this other kinsman redeemer, he says, look, you say whether or not you're going to redeem the property. Go ahead, yes or no. She's transferring her right of redemption. It's by right goes to you. If you say no, it comes to me. Now, are you taking it or not? And he winds up, he says, look, he'll take it. He says here, he says he would redeem the property. Now, you see that the actual redemption of the property from the third person, that's not reported. That takes place off stage. What you're talking about is the right of redemption. And so this guy says, and the near redeemer says he'd redeem the property. And then Boaz tells him, he says, look, you know that doing so, that carries the obligation of marrying Ruth. You see, because he's willing to accept that responsibility, that broader view. And so you see, it puts this guy in a kind of a tough spot. Because he either looks cheap or ungracious. He said, I'm not going to do that. Because he's standing here next in line and said, I'm willing to do it. He says, that's the way it works, right? So this guy's thinking about that. He said, yeah, I'll redeem it. But when he says, by the way, you understand that the kinsman redeemer duty is this broader vision that Naomi has proposed and that I accept. It includes that broader vision, you see, the obligation to marry Ruth in order to have children by her, so as to perpetuate Elimelech's name on the family land, to perpetuate his lineage in association with that land. Boaz just presents that as legal fact. You understand that's how it works, right? He presents that as legal fact, you see. I wish that bell hadn't rung, but I heard it. Okay, he presents that just as fact to be accepted. All right, so this guy says, he then declines to assume the responsibility of redemption as stated by Boaz, and he can save face because Boaz is already saying, I'm willing, so there's no harm. If he passes, then okay, well then Boaz is right there. So it gives him a nice psychological out. So he winds up saying, look, I really can't do that. You see, and the problem apparently, because Ruth's young enough to have children, that apparently changed the financial calculus this guy was doing. He says, if my buying this requires now that I'm going to have a child by Ruth, and that child will be the heir of the property and will inherit it, and it won't be part of my estate, I got to factor all that in. He says, well, I can't do that. Okay, he says, I can't do that. Well, Boaz then says, okay, cool, I'll do it. I'm in. All right, so he then relinquishes to Boaz the right and the obligation to redeem Elimelech's field and to marry Ruth. Oh, how far can I go? Okay. Boaz publicly calls on the elders here. He gathers them at the gate as a witness. You have this symbolic act of transfer of this right of redemption. So it's a legal deal. They had their ways of doing legal things. We got seals and whatever we use. And so they had their stuff. And so when I do this, all right, it's legal. And so that's what he had him do. He transfers the right to him, and then they pronounced a blessing on Boaz, and they prayed for Ruth and Boaz. And then we get in chapter 4, 13 to 17, we get that a son is born to Boaz, and the Lord grants them a son. Okay, Boaz and Ruth, they marry, and the Lord gives them a son, and the women of Bethlehem, they praise God for his kindness toward Naomi. And you see what's going on here is that because Ruth was the child's mother, and Ruth's commitment to Naomi is legendary. She's completely committed to Naomi's welfare and blessing, so they then know that the child of Ruth will reflect that same commitment. You see, and so they are able even to say, they wind up saying, a son has been born to Naomi. Has been born to Naomi, see, meaning the one born will be a de facto son to Naomi, will care for her as such. You know, he said, after all, I mean, Ruth was a better person than 7 sons would have been. So how's she going to transmit that? You see, so this child, his name is Obed, and that name means one who serves. So the child is named Obed. Now, the last statement before the formal genealogy, right at the very end of the book, the last statement before that is that Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. You see, Obed's birth, it crowns the reversal of Naomi's suffering, and it represents God's reward for Ruth's faithfulness. But beyond that, it has a tremendous historical significance because his grandson is the great King David. His grandson is the great King David, in whose lineage will come the Lord Jesus Christ. Let me close with this quote from Daniel Block. This is his commentary on Judges and Ruth. I know it's the print small, but I wanted it on one slide. He says, this book and this genealogy demonstrate that in the dark days of the Judges, the chosen line is preserved not by heroic exploits by deliverers or kings, but by the good hand of God, who rewards good people with a fullness beyond all imagination. These characters could not know what long-range fruit their compassionate and loyal conduct toward each other would bear, but the narrator knows. With this genealogy, he declares the faithfulness of God in preserving the family that would bear the royal seed in troubled times and in rewarding the genuine godliness of his people. If only the rest of the nation had demonstrated such covenant faithfulness at the same time. In this genealogy, the name of Boaz and Obed are indeed proclaimed far beyond Bethlehem and Israel to the ends of the earth. That was the prayer of the elders, is that be done. And you see this happening. But the narrator could not know, unless God told him, could not know what implications the piety of these characters would have on generations of his own people that would come after him. Because he's clearly writing after David has come to prominence. Because he's citing this whole genealogy about David. But he doesn't know, beyond that, what is in store. I'll finish reading this and we'll be through. Okay? He says, but the narrator could not know what implications the piety of these characters would have on generations of his own people that would come after him. If only he could have known that in the glorious providence of God, the Hesed of Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi would have laid the groundwork for the history of salvation that extends far beyond his own time and place. For as the genealogy of Matthew 1 indicates, one greater than David comes from the loins of Boaz. In the dark days of the Judges, the foundation is laid for the line that would produce the Savior, the Messiah, the Redeemer of a lost and destitute humanity. All of this God is doing while we're reading it about throwing up in the book of Judges. He's at work, just faithful people. Faithful people. God does great things through faithful people. Thanks for coming.